Judgment, Kehar Singh v. Union of India, Air 1989 SC 653. Introduction of the case. Kehar Singh v. Union of India is a landmark judgment of the Supreme Court of India dealing with the scope of the President's power of pardon under Article 72 of the Constitution. The case clarified whether the President can examine the merits of a conviction and whether courts can review the exercise of mercy powers. The decision strengthened constitutional balance between the executive and the judiciary. Facts of the case. Kehar Singh was accused of being involved in the assassination of Prime Minister Indira Gandhi. He was tried by a competent court and was convicted and sentenced to death. His conviction and sentence were later confirmed by the High Court and the Supreme Court, exhausting all ordinary judicial remedies available to him. After the completion of the judicial process, a mercy petition was submitted on behalf of Kehar Singh to the President of India under Article 72 of the Constitution, seeking pardon or commutation of the death sentence. The mercy petition was considered and rejected by the President, acting on the aid and advice of the Council of Ministers. Aggrieved by the rejection of the mercy petition, Kehar Singh approached the Supreme Court of India by filing a writ petition. He challenged the President's decision on the ground that the President did not properly consider the merits of the case and that the exercise of mercy power should be subject to judicial review. This led to the present case, where the Supreme Court was called upon to examine the nature and scope of the President's pardon power under Article 72. Issues before the court. The Supreme Court had to decide whether 1. The President can re-examine the merits of the case while deciding a mercy petition. 2. The President is bound by the judicial findings of courts. 3. The exercise of pardon power under Article 72 is subject to judicial review. And 4. The President must give reasons for rejecting a mercy petition. The main issue before the Supreme Court of India was to determine the scope and nature of the President's power of pardon under Article 72 of the Constitution. The court had to examine whether this constitutional power operates independently of the judicial process or is confined by it. A second important issue was whether the President can examine the merits of the case while deciding a mercy petition, even after the conviction and sentence have been finally confirmed by the courts. In other words, the court had to decide whether the President's mercy power is merely formal or whether it allows a substantive reconsideration on humanitarian or other grounds. Another issue before the court was whether the President is bound by the findings and conclusions of the courts while exercising the power under Article 72. The question was whether the President's decision must strictly follow the judicial verdict or whether it can go beyond it. The court also considered whether the exercise of the President's mercy power is subject to judicial review, and if so, to what extent. This raised the question of whether courts can interfere with the President's decision on the ground of arbitrariness, mala fides, or irrelevant considerations. Finally, the court examined whether the President is required to give reasons for rejecting a mercy petition. This issue related to transparency and accountability in the exercise of constitutional powers. These issues together required the court to balance executive discretion, judicial authority, and constitutional principles under the framework of Article 72. Constitutional provisions involved. The primary provision involved was Article 72 of the Constitution of India, which grants the President power to grant pardon, reprieve, respite, remission, or commutation of punishment. The case also incidentally examined the relationship between executive mercy and judicial process under the constitutional framework. Arguments of the petitioner. The petitioner argued that the President should independently examine the evidence and merits of the case before rejecting the mercy petition. It was also contended that the President's decision should be open to judicial review and that failure to provide reasons makes the decision arbitrary and unconstitutional. Arguments of the respondent. The Union of India argued that the pardon power is an executive function, exercised on the aid and advice of the Council of Ministers, and is not meant to act as a second appeal. It was further argued that courts should not interfere with the President's discretion, except on very limited grounds. Judgment decision of the court. The Supreme Court of India held that the President's power of pardon under Article 72 is very wide in scope and is not confined by the final judgment of the courts. The court clarified that the mercy power exists in addition to the judicial process and serves a humanitarian and corrective purpose within the constitutional scheme. The court further decided that the President is competent to consider the merits of the case while deciding a mercy petition. This means that even after the courts have finally decided the case, the President can look into the facts, circumstances, and other relevant considerations. However, the President does not act as a court of appeal. The decision is based on broader considerations of justice, mercy, and public welfare, not on strict legal reasoning. The Supreme Court also ruled that the exercise of mercy power is subject to very limited judicial review. Courts cannot examine whether the President's decision is right or wrong. Judicial interference is permissible only if the decision is shown to be arbitrary, mala fide, discriminatory, or based on irrelevant considerations. In the absence of such grounds, the courts must respect executive discretion. On the question of reasons, the court held that the President is not required to give reasons for rejecting a mercy petition. The court observed that the nature of mercy jurisdiction is special and confidential, and insisting on reasons may defeat its purpose. Applying these principles, the Supreme Court upheld the President's rejection of Kehar Singh's mercy petition and dismissed the writ petition. The court concluded that there was no constitutional infirmity in the exercise of the President's power under Article 72 in this case. Scope of judicial review. The court ruled that judicial review of the President's mercy power is very limited. Courts cannot examine the correctness of the decision but can only check whether the decision was taken mala fide, based on irrelevant considerations, or was arbitrary or discriminatory. Thus, the court maintained respect for executive discretion while preserving constitutional safeguards. Requirement of giving reasons. The Supreme Court held that the President is not required to give reasons for rejecting a mercy petition. The court observed that insisting on reasons may defeat the very nature of the mercy jurisdiction, which operates on broader considerations than strict legal reasoning. Ratio decidendi. The ratio decidendi of Kehar Singh v. Union of India is that the President's power of pardon under Article 72 of the Constitution is wide, independent, and humanitarian in nature, and it exists in addition to the judicial process. The President is not bound by the final judgment of the courts and may, while deciding a mercy petition, examine the merits of the case and consider factors beyond strict legal reasoning. The Supreme Court further laid down that although the President's mercy power is an executive function, it is not completely immune from judicial review. However, such review is very limited in scope. Courts can interfere only if the exercise of power is shown to be arbitrary, mala fide, discriminatory, or based on irrelevant considerations. The courts cannot review the correctness of the President's decision or substitute their own opinion. Thus, the ratio establishes a balance between executive discretion and constitutional control, affirming that the mercy power is meant to serve justice, mercy, and public interest, while being subject only to minimal judicial scrutiny. Significance of judgment. The judgment in Kehar Singh v. Union of India is highly significant because it clearly defines the constitutional scope of the President's mercy power under Article 72. The Supreme Court confirmed that the power of pardon is not a continuation of the judicial process, but a separate and independent executive function based on humanitarian and public interest considerations. This clarification helped remove ambiguity about whether mercy powers are merely formal or substantive in nature. The decision is also important because it balances the doctrine of separation of powers. While the judiciary remains the final authority on questions of guilt and legality, the executive is given space to correct possible harshness or injustice arising from strict application of law. At the same time, by allowing limited judicial review, the court ensured that the mercy power is not exercised arbitrarily or in bad faith, thereby protecting constitutional values. Further, The judgment strengthened the idea that constitutional governance is not purely legalistic but also humane. By recognizing that the president may consider the merits of the case, social circumstances, and public welfare, the court emphasized the compassionate role of the executive in the criminal justice system. Overall, the judgment is significant because it harmonizes executive discretion with constitutional accountability, preserves the dignity of the president's office, and serves as a guiding precedent for future cases involving mercy petitions and executive clemency, making it extremely important for LLB examinations. Critical analysis. The judgment in Kehar Singh v. Union of India has been widely appreciated for clarifying the breadth and humanitarian character of the President's mercy power under Article 72. By recognizing that the executive may consider the merits of the case even after judicial finality, the decision acknowledges that strict legal outcomes can sometimes produce harsh or unjust results, which a compassionate executive may correct. This strengthens the constitutional idea that justice is not only legal but also humane. However, the ruling has been criticized for limiting transparency. The court held that the president is not required to give reasons for rejecting a mercy petition. Critics argue that the absence of reasons can undermine accountability and make it difficult to assess whether the power has been exercised fairly. In a constitutional democracy governed by the rule of law, some level of reasoning is often viewed as essential to prevent arbitrariness. Another point of criticism is the extremely narrow scope of judicial review. While the court allowed review on grounds such as mala fides or irrelevant considerations, it barred courts from examining the correctness of the decision. This deference to executive discretion, according to critics, risks excessive insulation of mercy decisions from meaningful scrutiny, especially in cases involving the death penalty. At the same time, supporters defend the judgment by emphasizing the special nature of mercy jurisdiction. They argue that mercy decisions involve confidential, political, diplomatic, and humanitarian considerations that courts are not institutionally equipped to evaluate. Excessive judicial interference could convert mercy petitions into a third tier of appeal, defeating their constitutional purpose. Overall, while the judgment may be seen as weak on transparency, it successfully preserves the separation of powers and protects the unique, corrective role of executive clemency. The case thus reflects a conscious constitutional choice to prioritize executive compassion with minimal judicial oversight, a balance that continues to shape Indian clemency jurisprudence. In conclusion, it is a landmark judgment that clearly explains the constitutional scope and nature of the President's power of pardon under Article 72. The decision establishes that the mercy power is an independent executive function, meant to operate beyond the strict limits of judicial decisions, and is guided by humanitarian, equitable, and public interest considerations. The Supreme Court of India held that while the President can even examine the merits of the case, the exercise of this power is subject only to limited judicial review on grounds such as arbitrariness, mala fides, or irrelevant considerations. At the same time, the court protected the special character of mercy jurisdiction by ruling that the President is not required to give reasons for rejecting a mercy petition. Overall, the judgment reinforces the idea that the Indian Constitution provides not only for legal justice through courts but also for compassionate justice through executive clemency. It remains a key precedent for understanding Article 72 and holds great importance for LLB examinations, as it highlights the delicate balance between law, mercy, and constitutional governance.